All right, guys, let's jump right into it. So, during the whole pandemic situation, we've been hearing a lot about the flu. In fact, the flu numbers that we often hear about are being used, or should I say, were being used. I'm not sure how much now, but the flu numbers were being very heavily used to talk about how the current situation wasn't a problem. Now, I always thought that was interesting, right? There's always this background default understanding that the flu kills a lot more people than the coronavirus is going to kill. And so, we'd see people say, like, oh, the flu killed 66,000 people last year. The flu kills, 60,000 people every year, all of this. And I I would see those and say, okay, well, for one, this isn't the flu. That was a kind of a default position. I think that was fairly obvious and understood. Like, hey, this isn't the flu. This clearly is not the flu. So, that was one instance, right? Like the flu doesn't put this many people in the hospital. The flu doesn't cause this many problems in other countries. So, I, started thinking there's another situation here. I've never met anyone who's ever been in trouble in the flu, and not only that, but like, on Twitter, don't get me wrong, Twitter's not completely real life. It's funny, I have to say not completely because, basically the world is virtual now, and Twitter is kind of real to an extent, even though it's not, it kind of is. And there are like legit verified people that people know about and are aware of that are either in the hospital or aware of other people, their friends or family in the hospital because of this. Somebody I know on Facebook has somebody in the hospital because of the coronavirus, and it's not like an old person, it was like a 40-year-old lady. And so clearly, the effect of this is much, much higher than what people are realizing and or what people thought. And I'm wondering if that's because our assumptions are off. Our assumptions were wrong. What if the flu really isn't nearly as bad as what people say it is sometimes? What if what if the estimates of the flu are wrong? What if the deaths of the flu every year are wrong? Have we thought about that? Now, that couldn't be the case, right? Because everybody's talking about, it's the CDC and these models. But wait a minute. The CDC and other government officials have been saying that, in the Surgeon General, the CDC guy, Dr. Fauci, at first, he came out and was talking about how this wasn't a big threat to the United States. That was back in January, from what I heard. Then we have the Surgeon General coming out and saying bullshit like we don't need masks. We don't need masks. They don't protect us. So we're getting some weird shit. Now, what's more? The Dr. Fauci came out and did an interview, or he was talking, I think, at the White House, doing a press conference, and said, look, as the data comes in, we have to run it through our models and see how accurate the models are, and see if we need to change our underlying assumptions of the models. And some people have been pointing out, criticizing the models, because the estimates for the models, for example, that guy Neil Ferguson had model estimates of, a million deaths, 2 million deaths in the U.S. Other people had other very high levels of death in the U.S. and in the U.K. And people are saying, oh, look, the models changed. The models changed. It was fear-mongering. Well, I know a little bit about modeling, not a lot. Of course, yes, I took statistics, but I also studied economics, and that's where you learn about a lot of modeling. Now, economic modeling is it's not science. It's more, I don't even know the best way to describe it, but you take in data, you create equations, or you create some kind of equation with different variables, and you then collect data to test against your model estimation to see how things play out, and you can use your models to predict things. Now, this is what these epidemiological models do. The difference is that one difference that should be made between economics and this is that data between, there should be more real data. But here's the other thing is that epidemiologists probably cannot run a lot of experiments with their models, right? Like, yeah, they could do it in rats. They could probably get a population of animals together, but they can't really get like 1 million humans together and say, hey, we're going to run a test on you. And that is one problem here, is that anyone who's running models based off of non-experimental data that they can't even run experiments against, that it should be taken, not saying that it can't be scientific, I'm not really sure, but it should be criticized, it should be looked at skeptically. Now, I want to go ahead and take a look here at the CDC's yearly flu estimates. So, follow with me. The CDC says that they, we hear about all these deaths from the flu. So I want to know, how many people are really dying from the flu? So I went to the CDC's website to find out the influenza, the flu burden. And here's the first thing that comes up. How CDC estimates burden of the flu. The burden of influenza on the United States can vary widely from season to season and is affected by a number of factors, including the characteristics of circulating viruses, the timing of the season, population immunity to circulating viruses, how well influenza vaccines are working, and how many people have gotten vaccinated. While the impact of influenza varies from season to season, it places a substantial burden on the health of people in the United States each year. So, you notice it talks about estimates here. Let's see. CDC uses a mathematical model to estimate the number of influenza illnesses, medical visits, hospitalizations, and deaths of the United States, as well as the impact of the vaccine on these numbers. The methods used to calculate the burden of influenza have been described previously. They provide a link to a method. More recently, the same model was adopted to estimate influenza deaths in the U.S. This methodology has been used to retroactively calculate influenza burden, including deaths, going back to 2010. Interesting. So, the methods used to calculate the burden of influenza have been described previously. More recently, the same model was adopted to estimate influenza-associated deaths in the United States. So it looks like they have a model that they maybe have an updated model, and they're using it to go back and calculate previous deaths or influenza-associated deaths. So that should give you pause right there. Now, I'm not saying that these models are necessarily incorrect, but what we need to realize here is that these are models. We need to realize that these are models, and these are models that appear to have been changed. These are models that are not perfect. There's lots of estimating involved. There's lots of incomplete data. We don't really know what's happening. This page includes info, so they provide information here. It says, how does the CDC estimate influenza-associated hospitalizations? What methods are used to estimate the number of influenza-associated hospitalizations in the U.S.? Laboratory-confirmed influenza-associated hospitalization rates are obtained from the Influenza Hospitalization Surveillance Network, a collaboration between CDC, the Emerging Infections Program Network, and selected state and local health departments in 13 geographically distributed areas in the United States that conduct population-based surveillance. The network includes hospitals that serve roughly 9% of the U.S. population. Okay, so they have hospitals that serve roughly 9% of the U.S. population in 13 geographically distributed areas. And that is what they are using to measure the flu across the United States. So, right off the bat, I'm not saying that that is necessarily a bad methodology, but you're not going to get, there is a perception that the flu deaths are a fact. That the flu deaths are a fact, but they're not fact. They're estimates. They're estimates, and we need to know that. And this is clear. The reported numbers of hospitalizations are used to calculate hospitalization rates, and the rates are adjusted to correct for underdetection of influenza. So the default assumption of the CDC is that the hospitalization rates for influenza are underdetected. So I guess what they're saying here is that the hospitalization rates are not everyone who's being hospitalized for the flu is being reported as being hospitalized for the flu. So that means there is some percentage of people that we have no idea why they're actually being hospitalized, but the CDC is going to estimate that they're being hospitalized for the flu. Maybe not that they have no idea. It probably has to do with something else. This adjustment is done by using the percent of persons hospitalized with respiratory illness who were tested for influenza and the average sensitivity of influenza tests used in participating flu-serve-net hospitals. With the respiratory, so they do this adjustment by using the percent of persons hospitalized with respiratory illness who were tested for influenza and the average sensitivity of the influenza tests used in the participating flu-serve. So if you were tested for the flu, maybe you came out negative, but then they take all of the tests, and there's probably a certain amount of positive, certain amount of negatives, and they compare that to the accuracy of the test in order to determine how many were actually hospitalized from it. The data on influenza testing can lag up to 2 years. What the hell? So, at the end of the season, so far, more recent seasons testing data from prior seasons is used. So basically, every year, they're estimating the flu of this year based on the flu from 2 or 3 years ago. Adjusted rates are applied to the U.S. population by age group to estimate the total number of influenza hospitalizations. What methods are used to estimate the number of illnesses and medical visits? The number of illnesses were estimated from hospitalizations based on how many illnesses there are for every hospitalization, which was measured previously. So the number of illnesses is estimated by how many illnesses there are for every hospitalization. So for example, they might have an estimate that says for every person hospitalized, there are 10 people that have it that aren't hospitalized. Let's check out that number real quick. Ooh, references. Okay, so this is done by somebody else. Okay, so basically, I would have to check into that in more detail. Some people with influenza will seek medical care while others will not. CDC estimates the number of people who sought medical care for influenza, data from the 2010 Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. So this is also based on survey data. Influenza using data from a 2010 Behavioral Risk Surveillance Survey, which asked people whether they did or did not seek medical care for an influenza-like illness in the prior influenza season. So this is really interesting. This is based off of, they've got things here based off of survey data. They're looking at the number of, they're estimating the burden of the flu. Some of this is based on survey data for a flu-like illness. For an influenza-like illness. These people might not even have the flu. These people might have a cold. These people might have allergies, and they go to the doctor to get that taken care of. How the CDC estimates associated deaths. The methods to estimate the annual number of influenza-associated deaths have been described in detail elsewhere. And they talk about, they do the deaths to hospitalizations. So let me see here. How much time have I gone by already? Let's take a break. I'll be right back. Okay, guys, let's continue with more bullshit from the CDC. So, I'm only going to do a little bit more, and then I'm going to talk about some other stuff here, because this is a little heavy. Why doesn't CDC base its seasonal flu mortality rates on death certificates that specifically list influenza? So, here it goes. Seasonal influenza may lead to death from other causes. seasonal influenza may lead to death from other causes. So that's interesting. So seasonal influenza may cause death from other causes, such as pneumonia, congestive heart failure, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. It has been recognized for many years that influenza is underreported on death certificates. Okay, so this is an assumption, right? The assumption is that that influenza is underreported on death certificates for many years. There may be several reasons for the underreporting, including that patients aren't always tested for seasonal influenza, particularly older adults who are at greater risk of seasonal influenza complications and death. So here's an interesting situation. A lot of people are not even tested for the flu. So remember, these people are, they're assuming a lot here. Even if a patient is tested for influenza virus infection may not be identified because the influenza virus is only detectable for a limited number of days after infection, and many people don't seek medical care in this interval. So even many people who get tested for the flu may not show a positive sign for the flu, even if they had it in the past. And what's more is that they might not have even had the flu. Additionally, some deaths, particularly among those 65 years and older, are associated with secondary complications of influenza. So 65 years or older are associated with secondary complications of influenza, including bacterial pneumonias. For these and other reasons, modeling strategies are commonly used to estimate flu-associated deaths. Only counting deaths where influenza was recorded on a death certificate would be a gross underestimation of the influenza's true impact. So, do you see how it's possible that we are getting very high numbers for flu estimates, say 20,000 to 60,000 people died? First off, that's a huge fucking range. To say that maybe 20,000 people died, maybe 3 times more than that died from the flu, huge range, right? Now, what's also interesting about that is that when people talk about these ranges, it's like, man, really 60, 70,000 people die a year from the flu, and yet like you can't find anybody who really like knows anyone else who died from the flu? Maybe that's because they also had other situations, right? Maybe a smoker has chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and dies from pneumonia. Maybe it was from the flu, but could you really say that's from the flu? Like if a guy had trouble breathing and he got the flu, maybe the flu is what did him in. Maybe it's not, right? Maybe the estimate's way too high. Now, let's talk really quick about the limitations. This is what I wanted to talk about. The limitations are already fairly obvious at this point. First, it says the limitations of influenza burden. First, the rate of influenza-associated hospitalizations are based on data reported to the Influenza Hospital Surveillance Network that are current as of the time estimates are made. Final case counts may differ slightly as further data cleaning is conducted by FluSurvNet sites. The most updated crude rates for hospitalization for FluNet sites are available on FluView Interactive. Okay, so the data reported on hospitalizations are the rates of influenza-associated hospitalizations are based on data reported. Yeah. So basically, if it wasn't reported, which they are probably underreported, then you're not going to have all the data. Second, national rates of influenza-associated hospitalizations and in-hospital deaths are adjusted for the frequency of influenza testing and the sensitivity of influenza diagnostic assays using a multiplier approach. So they adjust for the rates of hospital deaths and hospitalizations. So they take all of the counted deaths and hospitalizations and they use a multiplier to say, this is how many more we think there are based off of their models. So once again, this is not based on, real concrete. The base data is concrete, most likely. But the estimates here could be based off of some very faulty assumptions here. However, data on testing practices during the current season may not be available at the time of estimation. In such cases, we adjust rates using data from prior seasons. Burden estimates from a given season will be updated at a later date when data on contemporary testing practices becomes available. So the data on the flu is super, super messy. That's something we need to keep in mind here, is that they take in data, but they're constantly using other years' data to examine, to make their estimates of the current rates of hospitalization. Third, estimates of influenza-associated illnesses are made by multiplying the number of hospitalizations by the ratio of illnesses to hospitalizations. So they estimate influenza by saying, okay, we think that there are, I think I already mentioned this, we think there are 10 people have it for all the people that don't go to the hospital. So this is how we estimate the number of influenza cases, okay? Estimates of medical visits are made by a similar process. These multipliers are based on data from prior seasons, which may not be accurate if patterns of care seeking have changed. So that means if less people are going to the doctor because of the flu, or if more people are going to the doctor because of the flu, these are heavily going to impact the numbers. Fourth, our estimate of influenza-associated deaths relies on information about the location of death from death certificates. However, death certificate data for a given season may not be available at the time of estimation. When this occurs, we use death certificate data from prior influenza seasons where these data are available from the National Center for Health Statistics. Specifically, our model uses the frequency of influenza-associated deaths that have caused death related to pneumonia or influenza, other respiratory or cardiovascular, or non-respiratory cardiovascular to account for deaths occurring outside of the hospital by cause of death. If these frequencies are not available for a given season for the time of estimation, we use the average frequencies of each cause from the previous season. So they look at things like, interesting, so influenza and pneumonia are counted together, even though there are many potential causes of pneumonia. You don't have to have the flu to get pneumonia. You can get pneumonia from other reasons. Fifth, estimates of the burden were derived from rates of influenza-associated hospitalizations, which is a different approach than the statistical models used in the older published reports. This makes it difficult to directly compare our estimates of seasons since 2009 to those older reports. Interesting. So, the estimates of burden were derived from rates of influenza-associated hospitalization, which is a different approach than the statistical models used in older published reports. This makes it difficult to directly compare our estimates for seasons since 2009 to those older reports. Those estimates from our current method are largely consistent with estimates produced with statistical models for similar years. However, it is useful to keep in mind that direct comparisons to influenza disease burden decades ago are complicated by large differences in the age of U.S. population and increasing number of adults aged greater than 65. So there are major problems and limitations to these flu models. I'm not saying that they're all wrong. I'm not saying that they're all inaccurate, but they are inaccurate, right? The models are wrong. The models are using older data. In fact, the models have changed so much that they don't even want to compare the models from the last 10 years to models previous models than that. So what are they going to do? If they make another change to the model, they're going to say, hey guys, so just to let you know, the model that we use for this year is no longer comparable to the last 10 years. When they make another change, what are they going to say? Now, I'm not an expert on these models, but I'm just telling you, reading how they calculate flu deaths should make everybody very suspicious, very skeptical, and it should also make you understand why you're never going to meet anybody you're never going to know anybody who's probably died from the flu. Now, yes, like, people do have complications with the flu. I'm not saying that that's not true or that's not possible. I just think that it's much less than what people are saying. So basically, a fraction of the people, come in with the flu. They're not doing extreme testing every year. They're just saying, hey, these are our estimates from models that we made, but we're not going to go out and test them all the time, right? The US CDC is not going out and testing models like you would think, or at least that's how it appears. And it also should be interesting to note that, one, the models they're using now do not compare with the previous decade before these last 10 years, and that the models do not take into account changes of behavior, if changes of behavior have been observed over the last 10 years. They do lump in influenza and pneumonia, even though pneumonia can be caused by other things besides influenza. The influenza tests are not even that accurate because people could come in and test negative for influenza, even though it's days after after they had influenza, they could still test negative. So there's lots of problems with the influenza testing itself. So we're not even truly getting accurate data on influenza. And yet people are walking around. And is that responsible? No fucking wonder all of these data outlets like Vox, like the USA Today, what is it? Vox, USA Today, CNN, NPR. Everyone's talking about, oh, don't worry about it. It's the flu, right? Because the CDC is releasing bullshit statistics for the flu every year. I think this year it said the flu statistics, it was between 24,000 and 66,000 people died of the flu. There were 400,000 hospitalizations and like 40 million people had it. Well, I mean, how do we know that? We don't know that. These are statistical models that have very, very tricky underlying assumptions that are based on data 2 and 3 years ago from a model that's not even comparable to things that were done 15 years ago. Important to note. Now, really quickly, I want to talk about something interesting from Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan. So, JRE has been continuing his podcast, which is fantastic, awesome podcast. And he's had on Brian Redband, Tom Segura, Bert Kreischer, Brian Callen. And it's been really great it's been a great source of entertainment during this whole quarantine lockdown period. One thing that I really liked that he talked about was how the other day he said this with Brian Redband, that the media is trying to play gotcha with the president. And he's not a fan of what the media is doing. Now, he acknowledges, hey, I get it. The president says stupid shit. The president does stupid things. He's saying, but look, this isn't helpful for the country. It's not helpful for the country when people are running around, running headlines, playing gotcha, reading back things to him to try to fuck him up, to try to trip him up, talking about, oh, you said this, but now you're saying this. What do you say about people talking about Kung Flu? They tried to say somebody in the White House said something about Kung Flu. Well, guess what? Nobody said anything about Kung Flu in the White House. It cannot be verified. It should not be treated as a fact, right? The person who said that somebody said the Kung Flu never came forward and said who made the comment. People are focused on racism. They're focused on all these different things. But they're not focused on really getting the facts and really getting the information on what's happening with the U.S. and how people can prepare themselves and how people can get ready and move forward. The media isn't doing their job. And it was really interesting to listen to Joe Rogan talk about that on his podcast. And how he's like, look, the media is so busy playing gotcha that, they're not even, they're not doing their job. They're wasting everyone's time. And this is something that many people have already known if you've been paying attention to the media. What else is going on? Joe Rogan was talking about moving out of California. I love that. He's talked about it 2 or 3 times. I think I heard him talk about it with Tom Segura, with Bert Kreischer, how he's talking about, getting out of California, moving to a different place because they don't want to be stuck in California when something else goes down. Because something else really could go down. The situation here with the coronavirus has made a lot of people realize how fragile our system is, how fragile our economy is, how fragile our infrastructure is to major disruptions like a virus. And we should all keep that in mind and remember these things. So anyway, that's all I got to say for today. I shall be back at a later time. Thank you for tuning in. You can follow me at my website, tstuch.com. Follow me, like, and subscribe on YouTube, Taylor Space Stutch. You can follow me on Twitter, tstutch1. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Hey guys, in this episode, we're going to talk about flu. I'm going to talk about the flu data, the flu statistics. So over the last several months, a lot of people have used the flu data to talk about how we shouldn't worry about the coronavirus. It left a lot of people unprepared or ill-prepared for what's currently happening in the United States. But what I'm going to do is we're going to question those assumptions. Why should we believe the data about the flu? How accurate is it really? In this episode, I'm going to dive into what the CDC uses to calculate the flu. You're going to find out there's a lot of bullshit involved here. At the end of this episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about Joe Rogan and what he's been saying recently about the media regarding COVID-19 and other things. But for now, we're going to do a little bit of a dive into flu stats and see what's bullshit and what's real. Buckle up. Oh, you can follow me on my website, tstuch.com, tstuch.com. Like and subscribe YouTube, Taylor Space Stutch. Follow me on Twitter, tstuch1. Thank you.